The parking lot outside the phone store was nearly empty at 4 in the afternoon. Just my car and a delivery van and a shopping cart someone had abandoned sideways across 2 spaces. I sat with the engine off, the heat building slowly behind the windshield, my phone resting face up on my knee like it might bite me if I touched it wrong. 47 seconds. That was what the technician had told me on the phone that morning, in a voice so flat and procedural that I almost laughed, because nothing about the last 3 weeks had felt procedural to me. 47 seconds of audio, recovered from a server backup that my stepmother didn't know existed, sitting in a folder with a case number instead of a name. My father had called me at 6:14 in the morning on the day he died. I had been asleep. The call had gone to voicemail, and sometime between that morning and the afternoon I tried to listen to it, the message had vanished from my phone, with my stepmother standing in my father's kitchen telling me she must have hit something by accident while she was just trying to help sort through his things. I believed her for about 9 days. Then I stopped. I picked up my phone, opened the email from the carrier with the recovery link inside it, and put my thumb over the play button. My hand was steadier than I expected. I think some part of me had already decided, sitting in that parking lot, that whatever was in those 47 seconds, I was finally going to let it speak for itself. But to understand why that voicemail mattered so much, why a grown woman would spend 3 weeks fighting a phone company for 47 seconds of her dead father's voice, you have to go back further than that morning. You have to go back to a house that smelled like cedar shavings and a man who never once raised his voice to say something that mattered. My father, Walter Hale, built things with his hands for almost 50 years. Cabinets mostly in the early days, kitchen sets for families in our town who wanted real wood instead of the laminate everyone else was buying. Later, after his knees stopped letting him crouch under sinks all day, he moved into furniture. Dressers, hope chests, a rocking chair he made for every baby born to anyone he loved, including, eventually, me. I grew up in his workshop the way other kids grew up at a kitchen table. I have a memory, one of my earliest, of sitting on an overturned bucket while sawdust drifted down through a shaft of afternoon light, watching my father run his palm along a piece of walnut to feel for a flaw before he'd even glance at it with his eyes. "Wood doesn't lie to you," he used to say. "People will tell you a board is straight. Run your hand down it and you'll know the truth before they finish the sentence." I didn't understand, at 6 years old, that he was teaching me something that had nothing to do with furniture. My mother died when I was 12. Ovarian cancer, caught the kind of late that doctors describe in careful, sideways language until eventually they stop being careful at all. I remember the hospital room more through smell than sight, the particular sourness of antiseptic over something sweeter and worse underneath it. And I remember my father sitting in a plastic chair beside her bed for so many consecutive hours that the nurses started bringing him coffee without being asked. After she was gone, he didn't talk about her constantly, the way some grieving parents do, turning a house into a shrine. But he didn't erase her either. Her gardening gloves stayed by the back door for years. Her handwriting stayed on a few recipe cards taped inside a cabinet, and he never took them down, even after he stopped really cooking from them. He just let her stay, quietly, in the corners of our life, the way you'd let a song keep playing in another room. He raised me alone for the better part of 15 years. He learned to braid my hair badly, and then, eventually, not badly. He learned which cereal I'd actually eat versus which one I'd push around the bowl for show. He came to every school event he could fit around work, sitting near the back in his good flannel shirt, smelling faintly of cedar no matter how recently he'd showered, because by then the smell had soaked permanently into his skin. He was not a man who said, "I love you," easily or often. He was a man who built me a hope chest for my 16th birthday out of the same walnut he'd used for my mother's, and who, when I asked him why, just said, "Felt right. You'll know what to put in it." That was the whole conversation. I have spent years since then deciding that it was actually a very long conversation, just spoken in a language that didn't need many words. By the time I was in my late 20s, settled into my own apartment 2 towns over, working as a furniture restorer myself, because of course I ended up working with wood. How could I not? My father had been alone for 16 years. He didn't seem unhappy about it. He had his shop, his dog, a handful of old friends he met for coffee on Saturdays. But I noticed, in small ways, that the house had gotten quieter than even a single man living alone should sound. The radio was on more than it used to be. He'd started calling me just to talk, with no particular news to report, more often than he ever had before. I didn't think much of it at the time. I think now that I should have. He met Denise at a community fundraiser for the volunteer fire department, of all places. A spaghetti dinner in a church basement that he only attended because a friend had guilted him into buying a raffle ticket. She was newly divorced, working the front desk at a dental office, with a teenage son named Cole who, by her account, had been struggling since his parents split. My father called me the next day, which itself was unusual, and told me about her with an awkward, almost boyish energy that I hadn't heard from him in years. She laughed at my joke about the raffle being rigged, he said. Actually laughed, didn't just do the polite thing. I remember feeling something warm and slightly nervous at once, the particular feeling of being happy for someone you love while quietly bracing yourself for change. I want to be honest about this part, because it would be easy to tell this story as if I disliked Denise from the very first handshake, and that isn't true. When I met her, a few weeks later, at a diner my father picked because it was neutral ground. She was warm and a little nervous herself, asking me real questions about restoration work instead of the polite throwaway kind. She brought up my mother once, carefully, saying she didn't want to step on anything and that she understood I'd had a whole life with my dad before she came along. I appreciated that. I told my father afterward that I thought she seemed kind, and I meant it. They married 11 months later, in the backyard of the house my father had built with his own hands, the same yard where my mother's garden had once grown, though by then it had been mowed flat for years. I stood beside him as the closest thing to a maid of honor he had, in a green dress Denise had picked out for me without asking, and I told myself the tightness in my chest was happiness with a little grief mixed in, which is, I think, mostly true. Cole was 16 at the wedding, sullen in the particular way of teenage boys forced into a sport coat. My father, who had spent his whole life either alone or raising a daughter, seemed almost delighted by the novelty of a sun-shaped person in the house. He started teaching Cole the basics of the shop, how to sand with the grain, how to listen to wood instead of arguing with it, the same lessons he'd given me on an overturned bucket 20 years earlier. I told myself this was generous of him, and it was. I told myself it didn't cost me anything that he was generous with someone else, and that part, looking back, was less true than I wanted it to be. The changes to the house came slowly enough that no single one felt like an event. A coat of paint over the hallway where my height had been marked in pencil since I was 4, Denise apologized when she realized, said she genuinely hadn't seen the marks under the old color, and I believed her, because it was a believable thing to miss. My mother's gardening gloves disappeared from beside the back door sometime that first year. When I asked, my father said Denise had done a deep clean of things by the entryway, and that he honestly hadn't thought to stop her, because what was the harm? They were just old gloves. I didn't argue. What would I have said? Those gloves meant something to me, and you didn't think to ask? It would have sounded, even to my own ears, like I was making a tragedy out of a pair of gardening gloves. So I let it go, the way I let go of a dozen small things in those first 2 years. Each one too minor on its own to be worth a fight. Each one a little stone added quietly to a pile I wasn't yet allowing myself to see. If you've ever felt like a stranger inside your own childhood home, like the furniture's the same, but the air belongs to someone else now, I'd love to hear about it in the comments, because I think more people carry that particular ache than ever talk about it out loud. By the 3rd year of the marriage, Sunday dinners at my father's house had quietly reshaped themselves around Denise and Cole. It wasn't anything dramatic. No one ever told me I wasn't welcome. It was smaller than that, the conversation drifting naturally toward Cole's community college classes, his car troubles, his new girlfriend, while my work, my life 2 towns over, got a polite round of questions and then slid back into the background. My father would occasionally try to pull the focus back to me, asking about a restoration project I'd mentioned, and Denise would listen for a moment before something else would surface. Cole needed help with a deposit on an apartment. Cole's car needed a transmission. Cole had gotten passed over for a promotion he deserved. and the room would tilt back toward him again, the way water finds the lowest point in a floor without anyone deciding it should. I told myself I was being petty. I had a good life. I didn't need to be the center of every dinner at 31 years old. But there was a particular evening, about 3 years in, that I still think about. My father had a minor heart scare, nothing dramatic, a flutter the doctor called nothing to panic about yet, but let's keep an eye on it. And I drove over the moment Denise called me, badly frightened, only to arrive and find Cole already there ahead of me, sitting in my father's recliner, asking my father questions about whether his life insurance was all squared away, in a tone that struck me as strange for a 20-year-old to use about his stepfather's heart palpitations. My father brushed it off as Cole, just worrying out loud. And maybe that's all it was. I want to be fair here, because fairness matters to me, and because my father raised me to run my hand down the board before I called it crooked. But something in me noted it anyway, filed it away the way you file away a strange smell in a house, not because you're certain it means anything, but because your body remembers it before your mind agrees to. A week later, my father called me alone, without Denise on the line, which had become rare enough that I noticed it immediately. He didn't say much. He asked about my apartment, about a chair I was restoring for a client, the ordinary things. But near the end of the call, almost as an afterthought, he said, "I want you to know I've been getting some paperwork in order, just being smart about things at my age with the heart business." I asked what kind of paperwork, half joking, and he said, "The kind that makes sure people end up with what's actually theirs." Then he changed the subject to the dog's vet appointment, and I let him, because that was how my father talked about things that mattered, sideways, briefly, and then gone, trusting me to remember it later when I needed to. I did remember it later. I just didn't know yet how soon later would be. By the 4th year, the drift had become something closer to a current. Denise had started, gently but consistently, describing me to mutual friends as sensitive about her mother, whenever some old object disappeared from the house, a description that managed to sound sympathetic while quietly recasting every loss I felt as an overreaction. My father, caught in the middle the way kind, conflict-avoidant men so often are, would tell me privately that he understood, that he hadn't forgotten, that I shouldn't take certain things to heart, and then say nothing when those same things happened again. I don't think he was being dishonest. I think he was tired and getting older and choosing the path that let him keep some peace in his own kitchen. I understood that even as it cost me something every time. If you've ever loved someone who couldn't fully protect you, not because they didn't want to, but because protecting you would have cost them a peace they badly needed, tell me that too. I think that's an even quieter kind of grief than the first one, and I don't think we talk about it enough. What I held on to, through all of it, was that phone call. The kind that makes sure people end up with what's actually theirs. I didn't know what he'd changed, or when, or how. But I knew my father had told me, in his own sideways way, that he'd done something. I tucked it into the same part of myself where I kept the memory of sawdust falling through afternoon light, and I waited, the way you wait for a board to prove itself true or false once you finally put weight on it. He died on a Tuesday in early spring in his workshop, with sawdust still settled fresh on the floor from whatever he'd been working on that morning. Denise found him. She told the paramedics, and later told me, that she'd heard a clatter from the shop and come out to find him on the floor beside his workbench, his phone still in his hand, the screen lit. By the time I got the call and drove the 40 minutes to the hospital, he was already gone. A second, larger event, the doctor said, something his heart simply couldn't recover from this time. I sat in a hallway chair that felt almost exactly like the plastic chair I remembered from my mother's hospital room 19 years earlier, and for a while I couldn't tell which grief I was actually crying for, because they had folded into each other, the way grief does when it has practice. It was Denise who first mentioned the phone. Standing in the hallway, her own eyes red, she said, almost as an offering, "He was on the phone with you when it happened, wasn't he? I saw your name on the screen." I told her no, I'd been asleep. I hadn't spoken to him and watched something flicker across her face that I couldn't immediately name. She said maybe she'd misread it, that everything had happened so fast, and I let it go, because grief doesn't leave much room for cross-examination, and because in that moment, I simply wanted to believe the version of the story that hurt less. When I checked my own phone later that night, sitting alone in my father's kitchen while Denise made calls to relatives, I found exactly what she'd described. A missed call from him at 6:14 that morning, and beneath it, a small voicemail icon. I remember staring at it for a long moment before I could bring myself to press play, my thumb actually trembling over the screen, because some part of me understood that whatever was in that message would be the last new thing my father ever said to me, and once I heard it, there would never be another. I pressed play and got 3 seconds of static, and then nothing. The icon blinked once and disappeared from my call log entirely, as if it had never been there at all. I sat very still for a long time after that. I told myself it was a glitch. Phones glitch, voicemails get corrupted, grief makes you imagine malice in ordinary technical failure. I told myself this for almost a full day, until I went back to my father's house to help start sorting through his things, and found Denise already partway through his office. Drawers half emptied into boxes, a filing cabinet standing open with several folders missing, and on the kitchen counter, half hidden under a stack of sympathy cards, a small business card from a locksmith 2 towns over, dated 3 days before my father died. When I asked her about the voicemail again, more directly this time, she said, without quite meeting my eyes, that she'd been going through his phone to save photos for the memorial slideshow, and that she must have accidentally deleted something while she was in there. She was so sorry. She hadn't even realized there'd been a voicemail at all. It was a plausible explanation. People delete things by accident constantly, especially exhausted, grieving people fumbling through a dead man's phone at midnight. But I kept thinking about the locksmith's card, and the half-emptied filing cabinet, and the phrase my father had said to me weeks earlier in a voice that hadn't sounded like an afterthought at all once I replayed it enough times, the kind that makes sure people end up with what's actually theirs. If you've ever had that specific, cold feeling, the moment grief and suspicion arrive in your chest at exactly the same time, and you don't yet know which one to trust, tell me in the comments, because I think it's one of the loneliest feelings a person can have, and I had no idea, standing in that kitchen, how right I was to feel it. I didn't say anything to Denise that night. I went home, sat on the edge of my bed, and called my phone carrier's customer service line at nearly 11 o'clock, asking a question I didn't fully expect to have an answer to: whether a deleted voicemail could ever, under any circumstances, be recovered. The woman on the line told me to hold, and came back 4 minutes later with a sentence that changed the shape of everything that followed. "We do keep backups on our servers for a limited window after deletion," she said. "If you can verify you're the account holder, I can open a recovery request for you. It usually takes a few weeks." A few weeks, she said, like it was nothing. Like she hadn't just told me there was still a chance to hear my father's last words to me, sitting on a server somewhere, waiting for someone to ask the right question before the window closed for good. The recovery request took 26 days, not a few weeks, in the breezy way the customer service woman had said it, but 26 actual days that I counted on a kitchen calendar like a countdown I'd never asked to be part of. I called twice during that window to check status, and both times was told the same thing in the same patient voice. "Still processing. Please allow additional time. We appreciate your patience during this difficult period." They had no way of knowing how strange it was to be thanked for patience. I didn't feel I had any choice about. I didn't tell Denise I'd filed the request. I'm not sure, even now, exactly why. Partly it felt private, the way grief sometimes insists on privacy even from people who share it. But partly, if I'm honest, some part of me had already stopped trusting that anything involving my father's last hours should be shared with her before I understood it myself. In those same 26 days, smaller things kept surfacing that I couldn't quite file away anymore. I found out, almost by accident, that my father had an appointment on his calendar 3 weeks before he died. A name I didn't recognize, D. Marsh, with a downtown address, no further notes. When I mentioned it to Denise, asking if she knew who that was, she said she assumed it was something to do with his old workshop insurance and changed the subject to funeral flowers. I let her change it. I was learning, by then, to let conversations go where she steered them while quietly keeping my own map of where they'd actually been. The email arrived on a Thursday, while I was in the middle of refinishing a client's dining table, hands covered in tongue oil, radio playing low the way my father always kept his. The subject line was plain: your voicemail recovery request, complete. I remember setting down the rag very carefully, as if the table itself might be disturbed by what I was about to do, and washing my hands twice before I let myself sit down with the phone. I drove to the parking lot outside the phone store before I played it, for no reason I can fully explain except that it felt like the right kind of in-between place. Not home, not the workshop, not anywhere already saturated with his memory. Somewhere neutral enough to receive whatever this was. 47 seconds. His voice came through rougher than I remembered it, slightly breathless, the particular cadence of a man talking fast because some part of him already sensed he didn't have much time. Hey, sweetheart, it's Dad. I know it's early, I'm sorry. A pause, the creak of a workshop stool, a thread of unease already in his tone that made my chest tighten before he'd said anything frightening at all. I saw something yesterday I didn't like. Denise, with a man at the house, looked like a locksmith's van. I didn't ask, probably nothing. Another pause, longer. But I want you to know I went and saw a man named Daniel Marsh last month. Everything's redone, properly, notarized, dated. He's got the original. If anybody ever tells you otherwise, you call him, not me, not her. You hear me. I sat in that car and listened to my father's breathing change, just slightly, just enough that 29 years of being his daughter let me hear something in it that a stranger wouldn't have. And if you ever need to find anything of your mother's in that house, you check the chest before you check anywhere else. I built that thing to keep things safe long after I'm not around to keep them safe myself. Then a sound I will hear for the rest of my life without ever fully explaining it to anyone who wasn't in that car with me. A clatter, sharp and close to the phone, the unmistakable sound of a tool or a hand striking a workbench, followed by an exhale that wasn't quite a word, and then nothing. 3 more seconds of static-edged silence. Then the message ended. I didn't cry right away. I sat very still, the way I had the night I first found the missing icon in my call log, except this time the stillness wasn't disbelief. It was recognition. My father had used the last clear minute of his life to leave me a map, in his own sideways, trusting way, and someone had tried to make sure I never found it. I called Daniel Marsh's office the next morning, expecting a receptionist, a callback request, the usual slow machinery of professional life. Instead, when I gave my name and explained who my father was, I was put through to him directly within minutes, and the first thing he said before I'd even finished my sentence was, "I've actually been hoping you'd call." He told me, gently but without hedging, that my father had come to him roughly 5 weeks before he died, not long after the heart scare, not long after that strange evening, with Cole asking about life insurance from the recliner. My father had told him, in Marsh's words, that he wanted to make absolutely sure the right people ended up with what was actually theirs. A phrase that landed in my chest with the force of déjà vu, because it was almost word for word what he'd said to me on the phone that day, the day I'd let him change the subject to the dog's vet appointment. The document my father signed was a revocable trust, properly drafted, properly witnessed, properly notarized in Marsh's own office with Marsh's own paralegal as the second witness. It named me as primary beneficiary of the house, the workshop, the business, and the bulk of his estate. It also included a specific, separate bequest for Cole, a modest sum, along with my father's good hand tools, the ones he'd started teaching Cole to use. There was a smaller provision for Denise as well, generous enough to be fair, far smaller than what she would have received under the original will he'd signed in the first year of their marriage, back when, as Marsh put it carefully, things looked different to him. He was worried, Marsh told me, that there might be an attempt to suppress this trust or claim it was never properly executed. He insisted I keep a certified original here in our file vault, separate from any copy he kept at home, specifically because of that worry. I have to tell you, at the time, I thought he might have been overly anxious given his health. I don't think that anymore. I asked him carefully whether a will or trust could simply be made to disappear. He explained, in the patient tone of a man used to delivering complicated news slowly, that a single missing copy wouldn't be fatal to a properly filed document not when a certified original existed elsewhere, but that a determined person, given access and time, could create real problems. A forged revocation, a claim of diminished capacity, a mudded timeline designed to make a judge hesitate. None of it would necessarily win, he said, but all of it could delay, exhaust, and frighten an heir into settling for less just to make the fighting stop. "Has anyone contacted you?" I asked. "Not yet," he said, "but I'd be very surprised if no one does." He was right within the week. Denise called Marsh's office, not knowing, or perhaps not yet realizing, that I'd already spoken with him, asking what she described as a few questions about Walter's actual will, and mentioning, almost in passing, that she had recently come across some updated paperwork in his office that she thought the family should discuss soon. Marsh, professional and unreadable, told her only that the estate would proceed according to the documents on file, and that all interested parties would be formally notified. That night, I drove to my father's house for the first time since the funeral, let myself in with my own key, and went straight to the hope chest at the foot of his bed. The one he'd built me at 16, the one I'd never thought to move out of his house because some part of me had always considered it more his than mine, sitting in the room where he could see it. I lifted the lid. Inside were the ordinary things I remembered: a folded quilt, a few photographs, my mother's wedding ring in a small velvet box. I ran my hand along the bottom panel, the way he'd taught me to run my palm along a board, feeling for what my eyes might miss, and found it almost immediately. A seam too clean to be original construction, a panel that gave slightly under pressure where the rest of the wood didn't. Beneath it was a manila envelope, dust-free, clearly placed there far more recently than anything else in that chest. Inside was a second certified copy of the trust, along with a single handwritten note in my father's unmistakable, slightly slanted hand. "If you're reading this, you already know to check the wood before you believe what someone tells you about it. Love you more than I ever said it. Dad." I sat on the floor of that bedroom for a long time before I could stand back up. The will reading, though by then it was really a meeting about competing documents, not a reading in the old dramatic sense, took place 3 weeks later in a conference room at Marsh's office, the kind of room with too much beige and a pitcher of water no one touched. Denise arrived with her own attorney, a brisk, careful man named Philip Ostrander, and with Cole seated beside her, looking, as he had at the wedding years earlier, like he'd rather be anywhere else. Ostrander opened by presenting what he called the controlling document, the original will from the first year of the marriage, leaving the bulk of the estate to Denise. Then, with a small, almost apologetic clearing of his throat, he produced a second document, a 1-page revocation, dated 9 days before my father died, purporting to nullify any later trust and reaffirm the original will, signed with what was presented to the room as my father's authentic signature. I felt the floor tilt slightly under that table, even seated. 9 days before he died was the same window in which my father had called me about paperwork. He was getting in order, the same window his heart had been steady enough, by every account, for him to still be working full days in his shop. Marsh, to his enormous credit, didn't raise his voice or his eyebrows. He simply asked, in the same even tone he might have used to ask about the weather, whether Mr. Ostrander's office would have any objection to an independent forensic document examiner reviewing the revocation before anyone treated it as controlling. Denise, beside her attorney, said quickly that she didn't see why that was necessary, that it was obviously his signature. Anyone could see that. A sentence that struck me, even in that tense room, as exactly the kind of thing a person says when they've convinced themselves that confidence is the same thing as truth. The examiner's findings came back 12 days later. The signature on the revocation matched my father's general handwriting in shape and slant, the report said, but it lacked something his more recent, verified signatures consistently showed. A faint, irregular tremor in the pen strokes, present in every document he'd signed in the 8 weeks after his heart scare, including the trust itself, witnessed and dated in Marsh's own office. The revocation's signature, by contrast, was smooth, confident, and steady, closely matching, almost too closely, a signature my father had used on an insurance form nearly 2 years earlier, a form that had at one point passed through Denise's hands when she helped him update his coverage after the wedding. The examiner's conclusion wasn't dressed up in dramatic language. It simply stated, plainly, that the revocation's signature was inconsistent with my father's documented hand during the relevant period, and consistent instead with an older sample likely used as a tracing or copying reference. The locksmith, when his name finally surfaced through the engagement records Marsh subpoenaed, turned out to be a quiet, visibly uncomfortable man who confirmed, under questioning, that he'd been hired to open a home safe roughly 2 weeks before my father died, at Denise's request, while my father was at a doctor's appointment. He said he hadn't thought much of it at the time. People get locked out of their own safes constantly, and that he had no idea what, if anything, had been inside it or taken from it. He wasn't accused of wrongdoing. He simply hadn't asked the kind of questions that, in hindsight, might have changed everything. Denise never raised her voice in that conference room, not once, which somehow made it harder to watch than shouting would have. She said, quietly, that she didn't understand how this had happened, that she'd never have done something like that to Walter, that she loved him. I believed, watching her, that some twisted, frightened version of that might even be true. That fear of losing the only stable home she and Cole had built in years had curdled into something she told herself wasn't really lying, just protecting what she'd already started to think of as hers. Cole, for his part, said almost nothing the entire meeting until the very end, when he turned to me in the hallway afterward and said, low enough that his mother couldn't hear, "I didn't know about any of it. The signature thing. I swear I didn't." I looked at this young man my father had taught to stand with the grain instead of against it, and I believed him too. Whatever his mother had done, Cole had been handed a version of the situation built for him by someone older, the same way I'd once been handed a version of grief that I had to slowly, painfully revise on my own. "I know," I told him. "Dad liked you. That part was never the lie." The probate court, once presented with the certified trust, the forensic findings, and the locksmith's testimony, ruled cleanly in favor of the trust as my father's valid final wishes. Denise did not face criminal forgery charges. Marsh explained that the evidence, while strong enough to overturn the revocation in probate, didn't meet the higher bar prosecutors typically require to pursue charges, and that pushing for it would likely cost more, in money and time, than it would ever recover. I decided, after a long conversation with myself in my father's empty workshop, that I didn't need that particular fight. I had what mattered. I kept my father's house and his workshop, and over the following months, I slowly turned the business into something that was unmistakably mine while still smelling. Every single day I walked into it, like him. I built a hope chest of my own design that first winter, working through the cold months at his bench, and gave it, unannounced, to a young woman in town who'd recently lost her mother, not as a grand gesture, just as something I thought my father would have quietly done himself, without telling anyone he'd done it. I honored the modest bequest he'd written for Cole in the trust, the small sum and the good hand tools, exactly as written, without resentment, because that provision had been my father's choice and not Denise's crime to inherit alongside her own. Cole came by the workshop once, almost a year later, awkward and visibly nervous, to pick up the tools in person rather than have them shipped. He stayed for almost an hour, asking quiet questions about a joint he was struggling with on a bookshelf he was building for his own apartment. I showed him how to run his palm along the board to feel for the flaw before he trusted his eyes. He looked at me like I'd handed him something larger than the lesson itself, and maybe, in a small way, I had. Denise and I see each other now only at the very edges of family occasions. A cousin's wedding once, where we exchanged a careful, civil greeting and nothing more. There's no warmth left between us, but there isn't open war either, just the kind of quiet, permanent distance that settles over people who once shared a house and a man they both, in their own flawed ways, loved. I still have the recording. I've listened to it more times than I could count in that first year, fewer times since, though I suspect I'll always keep it somewhere I can reach. What I come back to most isn't even the warning about Denise or the instructions about Marsh, though I'm endlessly grateful for both. It's the very last line, the one that almost got lost under everything urgent around it. Love you more than I ever said it. 4 words my father needed his own death circling close enough to finally say out loud, after a lifetime of saying it instead through cedar shavings and rocking chairs, and a chest built to keep things safe long after he couldn't keep them safe himself. People sometimes ask me, when they hear this story, whether I forgive Denise. I've stopped trying to answer that question with a single word, because I don't think forgiveness and consequence are actually opposites, the way we're taught to believe. I think you can understand exactly why someone became afraid enough to do something dishonest, and still let the truth stand exactly where it landed. I think that's not coldness. I think that might be the most honest kind of grace there is. What I carry forward, more than the house or the workshop or even the trust itself, is something my father taught me on an overturned bucket before I was old enough to know I was being taught anything at all. That wood doesn't lie to you if you're patient enough and humble enough to actually run your hand down the board instead of trusting whatever someone tells you about it from across the room. People can lie. Paper can be forged. Even silence can be staged for a little while. But somewhere, underneath all of it, there is almost always a truth still waiting to be felt out, quietly, by someone willing to take the time. My father left this world the way he lived in it, sideways, briefly, trusting me to understand the rest on my own. I did eventually. It just took a phone company's server, a hidden panel in a chest he built with his own hands, and 47 seconds I will never stop being grateful someone, somewhere, thought to save. If this story moved you, stayed with you, or reminded you of someone you've loved and lost, let me know in the comments. I read every single one, and I promise you, your story matters just as much as the one you just heard. Subscribe if you'd like to walk through more of these quiet, hard-won kinds of justice with me, and I'll see you in the next one.